On 8th December 1596, a group of 24 missionaries and Japanese converts is arrested in Kyoto. Their left earlobes are clipped off as a brand of shame, marking them as criminals and outcasts. They are then forced on a grueling 966-kilometer march to Nagasaki, where the execution awaits. Along the way, 2 more believers are added and the condemned group swells to 26. It is snowy, but the group braves on, singing hymns and sharing their faith with silent roadside onlookers. Some moved to tears but too fearful to speak. After days of dawn to dusk trekking, they reach Nishizaka Hill in Nagasaki on 5th February. One by one, including 2 babes and boys, they are bound to crosses and crucified, and in a manner reminiscent of their god, their chests are also pierced. As dusk fell and the cries faded, the bodies are unbound, incinerated, and the ashes scattered at sea. The message is clear: Christianity will no longer be tolerated in Japan. The Nagasaki Massacre of 26 Christians in 1597 was only the start of a ruthless campaign to eradicate Christianity from Japan, which is a sharp contrast to the initial warmth and even enthusiasm with which Japanese rulers had once greeted the new faith. In a period of drastic change, the same forces that once welcomed Christianity soon reversed course, seeking to drive the missionaries and their followers from the country. What could have caused such a drastic shift from tolerance to brutal persecution? Well, stick around, let's find out. To understand how Japan reached this tragic point, we must look back to the mid-16th century when the first Christian missionaries arrived on Japanese shores. The introduction of Christianity to Japan began in 1549 with Portuguese missionaries led by Francis Xavier. He arrived in Kagoshima with Japanese converts and fellow Jesuits, aiming to build a foundation for Christianity. Xavier's work gained respect, attracting many converts, especially in Kyushu. Around this time, Japan was in the Sengoku period. Sengoku period was a time marked by constant military conflict, social upheaval, and decentralized power, as regional warlords or daimyos vied for dominance. This near-constant warfare made alliances with foreign powers, including Christian missionaries, appealing for many daimyos. Missionaries, particularly the Jesuits, gained a foothold in Japan as local lords saw value in their connections to trade, the advanced technology, and the strategic advantage of foreign alliances, basically. One such daimyo was Omura Sumitada, who embraced Christianity not only for spiritual reasons, but also as a tool to consolidate power and modernize his domain with Portuguese influence. Sumitada in particular became a central figure in the spread of Christianity, for he allowed Christian missionaries to establish churches and schools within his territory. Amidst this upheaval and decentralization, one powerful daimyo by the name Oda Nobunaga, who managed to unify roughly a third of Japan, was particularly favorable towards Christianity. Oda saw the Jesuits as a counterbalance to the powerful monks, who often resisted his rule and held extensive land and influence. Oda's support allowed Christianity to expand into central Japan, and in retrospect, Christianity had found a new home in Japan. By the late 16th century, other than Portugal, Spain was another European power, quickly expanding its influence in Asia, especially through its colony in the Philippines. With Japan in proximity, the Spanish Governor-General of the Philippines viewed it as an opportunity to extend both religious and political influence. However, one Alessandro Valignano, who was tasked with overseeing missionary activities in Asia, advised the Spanish governor against any military invasion of Japan. Valignano emphasized Japan's military strength and advised that spreading Christianity, rather than entry via military conquest, could be appropriate in helping Spain lay groundwork for influence in Japan, but a decade would pass before Spain acted on his idea. Following Oda Nobunaga's assassination in June 1582, one of his generals, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, rose to power and continued Oda's mission to unify Japan. Initially, Hideyoshi followed in the footsteps of his predecessor and entertained the spread of Christianity in his region. However, this tolerance turned to suspicion after his conquest of Kyushu, where he observed a troubling pattern. Christian converts had been involved in the destruction of shrines and Buddhist temples, and these actions were seemingly encouraged by European missionaries. Additionally, Hideyoshi became convinced that some missionaries were involved in selling Japanese citizens into slavery abroad, particularly to Portuguese and Spanish traders. This observation led Hideyoshi to question the motives of the foreign clergy, suspecting they might be focused on undermining Japanese culture and sovereignty than merely spreading their faith. In 1587, Hideyoshi issued the first Antichrist edict, ordering missionaries to leave Japan. However, this order was only enforced sporadically, allowing Christianity to continue spreading quietly. With the arrival of Spanish Franciscans and Dominicans in 1593, tensions in Japan reached new heights. Despite the union of Spanish and Portuguese crowns in 1580, which had stipulated that Spain would not interfere with Portugal's colonial empire, Franciscan missionaries grew jealous of Jesuits' success in Japan and sought to challenge their monopoly on religious influence. Upon gaining an initial audience with Hideyoshi, the Franciscans interpreted his openness as a green light and began preaching openly near the capital Kyoto, thus disregarding Hideyoshi's 1587 edict against Christianity. This new influx of Spanish missionaries introduced a complex power dynamic. The Franciscans and Dominicans, who were backed by Spain, operated independently of the Portuguese Jesuits, often clashing over their methods and loyalty to competing crowns. The Jesuits, deeply concerned that the bold action of the Spanish friars would provoke Hideyoshi, attempted to dissuade them, fearing repercussions. But the Franciscans, who were drawing confidence from their successes in Americas, dismissed these warnings. Their actions, combined with a growing number of missionaries, amplified Hideyoshi's suspicions, leading him to view these foreign clergy as agents of colonial influence. But it was not till 1596 when an incident would confirm his fears and change the fate of Christianity in Japan for the next 300 years. In the closing months of 1596, the Manila galleon set sail from Manila to Acapulco. Due to the relatively late departure of the ships, the fleet sailed during the Pacific typhoon period. As a result, one of the ships, San Felipe, was hit by a series of typhoons and drifted towards the shores of Japan. The ship wrecked in a territory controlled by a local daimyo, and citing Japanese maritime law which treated wrecked ships as properties of local authorities, he seized its cargo and sent word to Hideyoshi. Hoping for intervention, San Felipe's captain dispatched envoys to Kyoto, bypassing the Jesuits and seeking support from Franciscan friars because San Felipe was a Spain-origin ship. However, court officials advised that the cargo be appropriated to the state. Hideyoshi embraced the idea, for the cargo would serve to supplement his diminishing coffers, dented by his ongoing Korean invasion. During interactions, the ship's pilot revealed a map illustrating Spain's colonial reach and claimed that Spain used missionaries to pave way for military conquests. This claim was relayed to Hideyoshi, confirming his suspicion of Christian missionary activities as a precursor to foreign domination. And it is at this point where all hell broke loose. In response, Hideyoshi ordered the arrest and punishment of missionaries who openly defied his 1587 Antichrist edict. This led to the crucifixion of 26 Christians, including 6 Franciscans, 17 Japanese converts, and 3 Jesuits mistakenly added, at Nagasaki on February 5, 1597. This brutal act signified the start of an increasingly aggressive campaign to eradicate Christianity in Japan, marking a turning point in the country's religious policy. But the 1597 massacre of 26 Christians was just but a beginning. Following the death of Hideyoshi in 1598, Tokugawa Ieyasu succeeded him and was initially tolerant of Christianity, taking advantage of the trading and navigation knowledge the missionaries had to offer. But his successor took a harsher stance. This intolerance launched a campaign of persecution and repression, culminating in several brutal massacres that cemented Christianity's status as a persecuted faith in Japan. Between 1617 and 1632, Christian persecution in Japan escalated sporadically, resulting in the death of 205 missionaries and native Christians for their faith. Of these, 55 were killed during the Great Jena Martyrdom, and another 50 during the Great Martyrdom of Edo. The Great Jena Martyrdom of 1622 was preceded by an incident involving a Christian Japanese merchant by the name Hirayama Jochin, who had an official trading sail for Manila. In 1620, Hirayama attempted to smuggle 2 mendicant priests disguised as merchants on his way back from Manila to Japan. However, his ship was intercepted by Dutch and English forces, who seized its cargo. The priest along with the crew were imprisoned in Hirado. Hirayama argued that his trading sail should have protected his ship, but the Dutch and English contended that smuggling priests invalidated such protection. After 2 years of imprisonment, the priest admitted to being missionaries. This confession led to Hirayama and the 2 priests being burnt alive, while the rest of the crew were beheaded in Nagasaki on August 19, 1622. This incident intensified the crackdown on Christians. Nagasaki's authorities ordered the execution of all priests held in Nagasaki prisons, along with some of their followers. In total, 55 Christians were executed on September 10, 1622 on Shizaka Hill, in Nagasaki, the same site where 26 martyrs of Japan were executed in 1597. After 19-year-old Tokugawa Iemitsu assumed leadership after his father's retirement in 1623, his first task as a shogun was to decide the fate of a group of 51 Christians arrested in Edo, modern-day Tokyo. As expected, the young shogun decided to follow in the footsteps of his anti-Christianity predecessors and ordered the execution of the 51 believers. On 4th December 1623, the condemned were paraded around the city before being led to the stake. One renounced his faith and was spared death. The other 50 believers were burnt alive. By now, the message was clear in bold and blood. Christianity was not tolerated in Japan, but perhaps the writings were still blurry to most foreigners. One Roman Catholic missionary from Spain left Cadiz in July 1622 and set sail for Philippines, and on arrival in 1623, his superiors assigned him to Manila. However, despite news of the constant persecution of Christians in Japan reaching the Manila base, Peralta still had a strong desire to evangelize Japan. Together with his companion, he departed Manila in August 1632 for Japan and arrived in Nagasaki days later. Unfortunately, the Chinese traders who gave them passage into Japan denounced their entry to Nagasaki authorities, and the two, upon learning of this betrayal, fled to the mountains. They were soon apprehended, and after refusing to renounce their faith, the two were burnt alive on December 11, 1632. Another 16 believers were to be martyred for their faith in the years between 1633 and 1637, before what is considered the greatest Christian massacre in Japan's history took place. In the mid-1630s, the daimyo of the Shimabara domain enforced harsh policies that imposed heavy taxes for the construction of the new Shimabara castle and severely persecuted Christians. In December 1637, 17-year-old Amakusa Shiro led a rebellion comprising primarily of the Catholic peasantry against the Tokugawa shogunate. With the help of the Dutch, Tokugawa Iemitsu responded by sending a troop of over 125,000 men. Due to the rebels' poor logistical support and the shogunate's overwhelming force, the rebels were forced to concede defeat months after the onset of the clash. In the aftermath, over 40,000 rebels were captured and executed by beheading in the final months of 1638. Sakoku was the only survivor, having been spared death for willingly betraying the rebels. Portuguese traders suspected of aiding the rebellion were expelled out of the country, and the shogunate in 1639 strictly enforced the Sakoku policy of national isolation. The Sakoku policy aimed to completely isolate the archipelago from the outside world with limited interactions only allowed with Chinese and Dutch traders. The aim was to drive out any Portuguese and Spanish elements from the country. The seclusion edict was clear. No Japanese shall leave the country, no Japanese shall return from abroad. For doing so attracts a death penalty. A reward was promised for whoever discovered a Christian. Portuguese and Spanish missionaries shall be imprisoned and their families banished to Macau. No bringing letters from abroad and no purchasing anything from foreigners. That was to be the way of life for the next 200 years. With this policy and even a harsher crackdown on Christianity, the number of Christians reduced significantly. Those who still held strongly onto their faith had to go underground and came to be known as Kakure Krishitan, meaning hidden Christians. Kakure Krishitan adapted their religious practices to blend elements of Christianity and Buddhism during Japan's period of Christian persecution. For example, Mary was often depicted in ways resembling the Buddhist deity Kenon, who was the goddess of mercy, and this representation was often referred to as Maria Kenon. Buddhist statues were engraved with crosses at the back. For the Holy Communion, they used rice instead of bread. The prayers were adapted to sound like Buddhist chants, yet retained many untranslated words from Latin, Portuguese, and Spanish. Since printed materials were at risk of confiscation by the authorities, the Bible and other liturgical texts were passed down orally, preserving the faith in secrecy. Then came the final blow on the religion, Fumi-e. In the mid-1600s, the authorities came up with a public way to root out the religion from the hearts of the people as a supplement for the executions in the ongoing campaign against Christianity. Fumi-e, which were brass images depicting Christ or Mary, were used as a loyalty test. Nagasaki, being considered as the Rome of Japan for its highest number of Christians at the time, was the first to be subjected to the practice. Every single person that lived in Nagasaki was ordered to go through the practice of stepping on the Fumi-e. Soon it became an annual practice carried out at the start of the year. But how was this supposed to suppress Christianity? These are just images, right? Well, no. During that time, Christians relied a lot on images. They prayed in front of images of Mary and Jesus, and so many thought that part of the God was inside the image. The images were conduits to the divine. Stepping on these icons was therefore a terrifying act of sacrilege. Again, the Fumi-e practice was a public renunciation of Christianity, which Jesus speaks against in the Bible. But many eventually gave in and trampled on the Fumi-e to avoid persecution. If we look closely at this original Fumi-e, one point in detail is that the face of Christ has been completely worn away due to the countless feet that trampled on it. An estimated 2,000 people refused to renounce their faith and did die as martyrs. Others pretended to renounce their religion but continued being Christians in secret. One of the paradoxes of the practice is that if all Christians had refused to trample on the Fumi-e and instead chosen to die as martyrs, Christianity in Japan would have also died. It is only because some made an existential decision to trample on the Fumi-e, despite their belief that this action was gravely sinful, that Christianity in Japan was not eradicated completely. Japan's Sakoku policy formally ended in 1854 after over 2 centuries of self-imposed isolation. This dramatic shift was precipitated by the arrival of American Commodore Matthew Perry and his fleet of black ships in 1853 and 1854. Perry used a strategy of gunboat diplomacy, whereby the display of superior naval firepower and the implicit threat of a force pressured Japan to open its borders to foreign trade and diplomacy. The resulting Treaty of Kanagawa, signed in March 1854, marked the end of Japan's isolationist policy, as it established limited trade relations between Japan and the United States. The coercive nature of Perry's negotiation left Japan in a precarious position. While the treaty initially permitted only restricted trade and access to specific ports, it paved way for similar agreements with other Western powers, further eroding Japan's isolation. The eventual influx of foreign influences, including Christianity, fundamentally reshaped Japanese society in the late 19th century, culminating in the Meiji Restoration of 1868. When Japan finally lifted its ban on Christianity in 1873, Christianity re-entered a country where the Christian population had dwindled from an estimated 500,000 believers during the height of missionary activity in the late 16th century to 20,000 hidden Christians. These hidden Christians had preserved their faith through oral tradition and creative adaptations, incorporating Japanese cultural elements to evade detection of authorities. As a result, the form of Christianity practiced in Japan at the time bore significant differences from the universal Catholicism, shaped by generations of isolation and cultural blending. Interestingly, many of these hidden Christians refused to reintegrate with the global Catholic Church when the ban on Christianity was lifted. They continued their localized traditions, reflecting both the resilience and cultural adaptation of their faith. Today, Christianity remains a minority religion in Japan, comprising less than 1% of the population, one of the lowest percentages in Asia, where other countries like Philippines and South Korea have substantial Christian populations. According to recent statistics, Christians account for approximately 0.9% of Japan's 126 million people, with the largest concentration found in Nagasaki Prefecture, historically the epicenter of Christian activity and persecution. This historical trajectory illustrates the resilience of faith under oppression, but also underscores the challenges of re-establishing a universal religious tradition in a society that had adapted it to fit local circumstances. Christianity in Japan, though small in number, is a testament to the enduring legacy of both cultural synthesis and resistance.